This is going to be a presentation about using live poker tells to help you know when to keep bluffing. So let's start up here. So just to make clear here, these are going to be tells that we're examining from waiting for action players. Those are tells, those are players who it's not their turn, they're just waiting to act. So for example, on the river, if it's your turn to act, they're waiting for you to act. And that'll be non-aggressor players too, checkers and callers, in other words. And that's just to basically say these are players who are not making a bet, in other words. So you're the bettor in this situation, and they're the people that are not betting. So we're examining that behavior. And the reason that's important to talk about is because the situations in poker can be so different, and it's very important to think in terms of the situation. So behaviors from a player making a significant bet can be very different and even opposite from players who are in non-aggressor, waiting for action kind of situations. The psychological stuff is just so different, the things that, the forces acting on them, the factors involved. And that's an important thing, because not knowing that can sometimes lead to people thinking, oh, okay, I saw them behave this way in that spot, and it was weak, and I saw them behave the same way in another spot, and so it must be weak. But sometimes those can be, completely opposite. So it's good to think about the situation. So let's see, what is the main pattern we're talking about here? The general pattern to remember is that most out of the ordinary, so-called ostentatious behaviors from these kind of players will make strong hands less likely. And examples of, ostentatious behaviors would be things like saying something, joking, staring at you, assuming staring at you is not normal for them in those situations. Dynamic movements, grabbing chips ostentatiously, just anything that's out of the ordinary that for them in that situation, because most people do behave rather stoically in most poker situations. So we're talking about things that seem rather out of the ordinary, and ostentatious is a way to refer to that. It's kind of like attention grabbing. And so the general behavior is that strong hands from those strong hands are less likely when they're doing this kind of attention grabbing, more ostentatious, more attention grabbing behavior. And the more ostentatious the behavior is, the more likely it is to be a weak or medium strength hand. And so that helps explain why, like, some of the more, if you're not really sure if it's ostentatious or out of the ordinary or not, that's probably a sign that it's less likely to be, to hold to the general pattern. But even for the more subtle varieties of it, that can be helpful for making close decisions too. So, let's say, for example, to be specific, you're thinking about betting, you're thinking about bluffing on the river, and your opponent does something that seems a little bit out of place for them, like, say they check on a little bit on the harder side, or they, say check in a slightly more forceful tone of voice than usual. Those kinds of things, even if they're on the more subtle side, and if you have a close decision, those can be reasons to fire a bluff in those situations if you're a little bit on the fence. And like a lot of tells in general do tend to be one of the big reasons they're valuable, especially for the tougher games you're in, is because when you're in those borderline situations, you're using a tell, a behavior that might just be a little bit more reliable and not, right? It doesn't mean that you believe that they're 90% reliable. It just means you believe they might be like 60% reliable, a little bit better than chance. And that can be real valuable, if you're making a lot of decisions, and that those little edges can add up. I just want to include something here that Alex wrote regarding, we were having a discussion about these things, and he wrote something recently, and he talked about how this idea had really changed his perspective on on these spots and thinking about how, when you have strong hands, players behave more stoically. They don't want to draw attention to themselves, and that becomes, have somebody who has aces or kings pre-flop is a good example of that, because we probably all seen those patterns of when somebody gets a good hand, especially early in the hand when the pot's small. They're focused on like, how can I get the maximum amount of money? How can I, what's my best line? And also just an instinct to not draw attention to themselves. When somebody's basically like, setting a trap for someone in poker or in real life, if you were literally setting a trap for someone, your instinct is to not draw attention to yourself. So those are some of the reasons why these patterns exist. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about why the pattern exists. Players who want you to bet, they'll tend to be stoic. They have an instinct to not draw attention to themselves. They're like someone laying in wait for you, like someone, who set a trap in your path or something, who wants to attack you. They want to seem weak and unassuming. They have a tendency and a motivation to portray themselves as weak and unassuming. Whereas players who don't want you to bet, who have, weaker and more medium strength hands, they will sometimes want to try anything to prevent you from betting. And this can include verbal stuff, or it can include playing with chips or cards or staring, the things we talked about. There can also be an element of, sometimes wanting to seem relaxed, but a way to want to seem relaxed with the situation is sometimes to do something kind of ostentatious to show you're relaxed, do something, talk loudly or joke, or, even physically tap the table hard or whatever it may be. So those are all reasons for why this general pattern exists. Not to say, obviously it can vary, but we're talking about general patterns here. Some caveats for this, because there's always important caveats. This pattern mainly is about making the top of a player's range less likely. Players can still have pretty decent hands, pretty decently strong hands, and still not want to face a bet. In other words, a player could, have these kind of behavioral tendencies with a pretty strong hand that they almost always will call with, right? So it's just about making us a little bit more, making things a little bit more likely that they probably don't have, less likely they have the top of their range, which is, still valuable. If you feel that's valuable information, that's eliminating, or at least reducing the weight of a lot of those top range hands. And obviously the other main caveat is that players are still capable of calling you no matter how weak their hand is. And that's just a general, a frustrating thing about tells in general. Like, if you can read somebody for a week all day, and you could be very certain that they're weak based on previous patterns, or just about how they're behaving in general, and they could still call you because, people are unpredictable. They're capable of doing all sorts of things. So, that helps explain why, you'd be more likely you'd want to take into account how loose or tight you've seen a player be in the past. Like, no matter your reads, it might not be a good play to try to bluff someone who you're confident has a weak hand if you think they're often going to be calling anyway. So on the flip side, I've talked about tells of weakness, basically, like how do you decide when to continue bluffing? And I purposely named the course, this video, that to focus on when to continue bluffing, because it's much harder to get tells of strength. Like, so that's why it wouldn't have called it, when to continue bluffing and when to stop bluffing. It's just much harder to tell when to stop bluffing based on tells of strength. And why is that? It's much more rare to get those tells of strength from these waiting for action, non-aggressor players. And why is that? It's because most players just behave stoically in general. So most stoic, strong hand behavior, the kind of behavior we talked about, where a player has, pocket aces and they suddenly become a little bit more stoic, a little bit more reserved, unassuming. That stuff tends to blend in with the majority of most players' stoic behavior in general, right? So it's just surrounded by other similar behavior, or alongside other similar stoic behavior, which makes it harder to determine. That said, you will occasionally notice that someone seems more calm or quiet than they usually are. And that's sometimes why you can get a read of, like, say, pre-flop, when somebody's like joking around or loose in their mannerisms, physically loose, and they suddenly look down at a hand and suddenly get into stoic, serious mode. Um, that can often be, a meaningful or actionable tell, at the very least, to tell you to tread a little bit more carefully. Um, Same with sometimes later in the hand too, if somebody goes from, you know, uh, joking around or having a smile on their face about something, and the river hits and they suddenly get really stoic and quiet and freeze up. That can be a sign that something happened. But, you know, just want to emphasize that those aspects are much less useful in general, and it fits into the general pattern of getting tells of weakness from waiting for action non-aggressor players. Most of the tells you'll get from those players will be tells of weakness, whereas it's the opposite for players making significant bets. Most tells you reliable information, tell information you get from players making significant bets will be tells of strength and relaxation. So it's reversed for the two categories, basically. And just for people that weren't aware of my stuff, I wanted to give an overview of my current content if you weren't aware of it.